G'day, Legends. I hope you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a brilliant week. Now, Legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, but the two specifics we're going to look at today is Pokrovsk, the situation that is unfolding there, as well as the US sanctions against Russian oil companies, and see how much impact that is actually going to have. Of course, between that, we'll be looking at other maps, a little bit of miscellaneous stuff as well. But that Pokrovsk sector, we know that this is deteriorating because you will see the amount of informational warfare being carried out everywhere to try and save and skew the narrative on that. Ostensibly, Pokrovsk is under control and everything is going great. What we're going to do today is actually look at the maps, the situation, other areas that are being cut off, and see the reality of the situation that's unfolding here and what may come following this. Okay, so as always, a fair bit to go over. What we see is the continued celebration of that dam that was taken out in Belgorod Oblast and the flooding, of course, downstream of this. And I do wonder if we'll see someone like Miss Kaya Kallas then disavow this, as has done before, about a war crime with then turning water into a weapon. When we look back at Novokovka Dam, I sadly don't think that we will. A couple of other things as well. I thought this was interesting. You and I on this channel, we speak a lot about Mr. Scott Bessent, the US Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Andrew Geek, on another YouTuber, he's done a really good breakdown of this, but I think it's worth you knowing, just to get an idea of the closed sort of system that we have at the moment, is what we've seen is this $40 billion bailout for Argentina. Now, of course, this has happened without congressional approval because the government is currently in shutdown. Okay, so it may make sense on the very surface, but what we need to look a little bit deeper and see that these behemoth investment funds, Discovery Capital, George Soros, the Quantum Fund, we look behind this, and what you'll see is both of these Mr. Bessent has worked for in the past, either officially or contracted, but they also hold billions and billions in Argentinian bonds that have gone to shit. It's worth going and having a look at that video. I found that very interesting. Now, something I said yesterday was I said, there's a name I couldn't think of. And I think this is just something interesting to go over because you get, again, this sort of closed system. And apologies for my use of AI here. Again, this is what I was referring to yesterday. I said I couldn't remember the name. That Paul Warburg was the name I was looking for. This was German-born American banker and economist, a key figure in creating the Federal Reserve System. Of course, a lot of criticism is because of his German birth, Jewish banking background. We see making then the US Federal Reserve. But this is where it gets very interesting. He became the intellectual architect of the Federal Reserve. He was under Woodrow Wilson. He was appointed here as well. Woodrow Wilson, of course, the American leader, First World War, brought a family network. His brother Max remained in Germany, advising the Kaiser's government during World War II. His son James later became Roosevelt's advisor on monetary policy, and his nephew Eric served in the US Army intelligence in World War II, and then later founded the first private equity houses. Gives you an idea of the amount of then pull and leverage in these economic systems, but how little amount of people may have huge control in this. Okay, so now we're done the sort of miscellaneous parts of this. Let's actually get into the video. Let's look at Pokrovsk. So let's go here. We have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, red check on this map, Russian gains, blue check, Ukrainian gains over the past 24 hours. Now we need to come down into Pokrovsk. Now, this map itself shows this as a critical situation, but again, the situation shown on this map is the best possible scenario. Of course, this map has been in trouble before. This is deep state map. We're showing too real of a situation, allegedly threats against them, but as well links in with Ukrainian MOD and does ignore a number of geolocations or other movements. The reason we use it is as a good baseline, especially as we see Russia on the offensive and advancing. It's a good baseline because that confirms where the movement is. But let's have a look at some other mappers. We'll look at Mr. AMK. We'll look at Mr. Suryak. So Mr. Suryak, he has 3 days of mapping. And you can see today, 3 days ago that 55% of Pokrovsk is now under Russian control. The next map shows movement on the western side, movement down Minograd and just below Minograd as well. So further squeezing that vice grip. Deep State today, they talk about Russia's continual advances to try and get a foothold around Moskovskoye and Minograd, also to his final map here, and just a little bit of ground being made to the east. But you can see a lot of Pokrovsk coming under control and movements at least onto the outskirts of Minograd. But this is not the whole story at all in this sector. Now, the agglomeration, you and I will typically refer to as the Pokrovsk pocket, but I think this may be more remembered for what will unfold in Minograd if it continues moving in the way that we are seeing. What we were warned by from Ukrainian officers in this sector, that is, if Pokrovsk falls, how are the troops who are already dislocated in Minograd, in areas like Sukri Yar down in the south, these are already dislocated forces. How are they getting out of this sector if Pokrovsk falls? So I've done some just lines on this, but you can see by AMK where then these roads and networks into, like Minograd down in the south, where these are either getting physically cut or the drone coverage that there has been over months in this sector. I have real concern for what is going to become of Minograd, Sukri Yar down in here. This shape is at this point a crisis, head first leading to catastrophe. Now, of course, Russia will take advantage of this envelopment here with its artillery supremacy and the Rubicon units if there is any attempt to withdraw out of this. And this is why, in my opinion, we're seeing very little effort by the Russians and resources put to currently hold north of this sector, Kushetiv Yar area. We'll look at that in a second, where Ukraine is having advancements. That's why Russia's not pouring stuff into that sector, is because it can focus on this down here, what will have far longer effects on the war than up there. Now, we do have scattered reports that Ukrainian SOF, I spoke about this yesterday, and other units are being deployed into Pokrovsk to try and unblock this sector. But what I'm saying is it is very late for those actions. And just by this map here, again, which is going to be painting the best possible scenario, the actual length between the grey zone is 5 kilometres. That is very, very narrow. So watch this space continuing to unfold. Now, the online propaganda, information, the activists, not the analysts, although some of them claim to be analysts, this is in absolute fifth gear, NOS buttons, overdrive to try and save the narrative in this sector. We see countless claims like, well, this is a good thing because there's so many Russians dying here. It's a good thing we're surrounded in 270 degrees because then we can shoot in any direction. That is it. And what we have seen and what I've gone over before was recount the First World War, that when we see actions and ground being lost and troops on the back foot, what the media lean into is just massive infantry losses on the other side to sort of shadow the reality of it. And this is what we're seeing. But I don't see how anyone could look at this map with the knowledge that Russia has superior levels of men. So they've got more people, they've got superior artillery and drones in here, and say that, no, this is a superior position for Ukraine at this point in time, with the fabs, with the drones, with the whatever landing in here. Imagine the wet dreams barring up that these bloggers would be having if this was in the other direction. But I've taught before a lesson on propaganda that I think holds incredibly true. The winning side, whoever that may be at a point in time, but the winning side will tend to embellish claims. The losing side will tend to fabricate claims. And that is a lot of what we're seeing in here. I can't believe someone could hold an audience posting a map looking like this and going, this is actually a good thing. What are you? You are betraying the soldiers of which you are saying you support. Now, the reality of this sector, this is the same story we have seen again and again. We can call it Sursky's pocket if you would like. Russia builds on the flanks. Ukrainian senior command, they maintain a no-step-back policy. They won't move back due to optics, to PR, and insufficient fortifications and manning of those fortifications as well, because it's easier to hold a city with less men to a degree at least, but a lot of it is backed by optics-led tactical decisions, which can be a nightmare. And the Russian command, again, has leveraged that to create the pocket that we have now seen in an attritional war. Trust me, a pocket like this is the worst possible thing you can see. Can Ukraine save this with a deployment of other reserves to unlock this somehow and save a catastrophe? Potentially. I know other people online think that there's just hundreds of thousands of soldiers sitting somewhere in reserve. That's just not the case. That's why drones are being used instead of men in fortified defensive positions. But I can't see the amount of troops needed to try and unblock this, as firstly, if it is possible at all, but secondly, not having then huge impact on other areas of the front that then would start collapsing. And we've spoken about that. This is what you want to do if you've got numerical superiority in an attritional war, is have your enemy like a pinball machine, that you move here, they have to move troops to stabilize, but then you start moving there. And this is where we see Russia at the moment with several pockets, maybe 8 or 9 different axes that they're advancing on, because they are leveraging their numerical figures. And pockets like this could turn into a catastrophe. And what I spoke about, must be 18 months ago, I spoke to an analyst behind the scenes, very, very knowledgeable guy, and he said the biggest danger for Russia or Ukraine is a huge loss of people in one singular area, and that you can never sort of get back on your feet following this, and you have a snowball effect. And this area in here, it is looking more and more like this, but depending on what media you take in, the pseudo-environment has been set, of which being surrounded on all sides is now a good thing. So watch this space. Okay, so to the north of here, we see more blue check to Kushetiv Yar, and to the east of Vilny, Novoshakovka, still dislocation according to this map of Russian units. We'll go back to yesterday and then to today just to get a bit of a better idea of where that has actually moved. Let's look at Suryak's map in here. And again, these maps are showing fairly similar, but the other maps just aren't showing the dislocation of these forces. But Kushetiv Yar area, that there has been advancements as well from Vilny and Novoshakovka as well. They are showing this, but they're just showing it as that has just been pushed back, not this large dislocation and claims of thousands of soldiers taken POW or killed in here, of which I guarantee if thousands were taken POW, we would have seen video of said thousands. Mr. AMK, he is showing this, but a little bit more. So Kushetiv Yar down, similar, Novoshakovka, but just down under as well, from Dorozhny to Zatishtok as well. So if we zoom in just a little bit, that he's showing Dorozhny is still under somewhat of Russian control, but this movement down in around Sorozove, Fedorovka as well. Again, some of the labeling can be a little bit off, but you understand the situation. But also that Russia is still pushing around Shakhovka area. We saw that armoured movement on the eastern side of here, and he does say in this, I believe, that mechanised assaults were carried out. However, no evidence of consolidation yet. So we're not exactly sure how that looks. But keep an eye on this sector further unfolding and deteriorating. Because what we do know, and the history of these areas has shown us, it can hold for months and months and months and then deteriorate very quickly. The biggest question of this whole sector in here is, where does it fall back to? We saw this at Avdiivka. We saw this with Hurikove. We saw this with Vuhledar. We saw it with many sectors, that once it moves, it can go tens of kilometres until it actually stops. So this has basically been a free fall from Avdiivka to Osheretne at the time. So keep an eye on that. Where it stops, I do not know. Let's move down then to the south, the Velika Novosilka front, where this is continually moving. No changes shown on this map today, but we do have some Suryak maps. So around the Velika, Mykolaievskia front, during the last 3 days, Russian army began assault locality of Veshneve. So we can see this front here, and then his next map, So it was just this sector, and then Vishneve and Novoaleksandrivka, more movement being made. I'll show you where this is. So we zoom down in on this sector. So this is Novoaleksandrivka, Vishneve, and movement out in the direction of Danilivka as well around Pavlivka. But this whole front marching on this axis, which is not surprising at all. It will likely continue marching on this axis for at least another dozen kilometres, and then I think we'll see actually a southern push down on Huliapol. Again, we will see. That'll depend on the effectiveness and the efficiency of the fortifications that remain in here. We have one more map on the Huliapol front, which is just south of here. The Russian army continue advancing west of Poltavka. So, of course, we have Poltavka and advancing where this grey zone is shown in here. So this front is continually moving. We spoke at length yesterday about this area and military victory sort of being off the table. Let's look Konstantinivsky pocket that has been made and will likely continue to be made once Pokrovsk falls. But you can see this is still in a pocket. We have the Katerinivka area. Again, this envelopment within an envelopment that did grow very severe. Suryak, he is saying that this area has been cleared. We have other mappers like Playfra a couple of weeks ago saying that under a fog, Ukrainian forces were able to get out with relatively few casualties actually by floating across this waterway here. Again, it's still difficult to know exactly in here, but we do know many are questioning what the purpose of holding this area was at all. So we'll see. That's what at least Surek is saying, is it's closed up, and that he's showing on Konstantinivsky that on the very outskirts that there has been then Russian forces then breaking into Katerinivka actual over the last 72 hours. Small recon groups to continue to destroy Ukrainian defences in this area. So keep an eye on that. I know there is some geolocations where there is looking like artillery targeting from Ukraine into these sectors, so we'd presume Russian forces in that area. So let's go on to our maps for the remainder of the maps that we have. Let's start down in the south, this area down in here, Stepnogorsk, Plavny. We have seen this back and forward for some time. On this front, it does show, at least according to Surek, some small Russian advance down along where the Dnieper sits, right down into this sector. Keep an eye on this. Again, I think that currently the priority is the fall of Pokrovsk, but the priority large scale is the southern region in here more so. Now, let's then have a look up into the Liman front line. So we come, of course, we have Liman, Yampil, Zadachny, areas you will, of course, be familiar with, where these sitting on the north of Seversk area. Let's have a look here. That according to Suryak maps, this is the movement into the outskirts of Liman and outskirts of Torshke Zadachny area as well. Remember, grey zone showing up in these sectors, and my information from the ground that there are DRGs present in the centre freight areas, which we presume is the rail in the centre of Liman. Furthermore, this is then around on the top area of this Liman Seversk front. Russian army continued advancing inside Svati National Park of Liman and reached the outskirts of the Quarry and Dronivkia front line. So we'll zoom out just a little bit more. We'll give you where this is then actually sitting, and you can get where Seversk is, and further movement across this front line where my cursor is at the moment, and exploiting those recent gains and leveraging against then the two fronts meeting and the forested areas. Now, will come up the Kupiansk pocket that has formed. Pishane, we see, say, a 3 kilometre maybe movement, 4 kilometre movement in the direction of Pishane. Again, this pocket is going to be very, very difficult. This is one of these areas I've spoken about. In order to try and save Pokrovsk, we could see the abandonment of other fronts. We've seen that again and again. Areas move much quicker when there has to be reinforcements sent. Look at when Kursk offensive got launched, what then occurred down in the Donbass. Last area is of Vovchansk. Let's have a look here. Suryak maps. Russian army took full control over the locality of this and reached the outskirts of other sectors in here. So you can see where this forested zone is, down to this other Liman area. It's fantastic that this same village is named multiple times, so down through this sector. And it is funny to see, and this map has confirmed there has been some recent Russian gain in Vovchansk, that there has been an increased push by the Russian forces in Kharkiv, not only on the Vovchansk front, but on the Overdrive front as well. My opinion on this is that this is not even a secondary axis. All this is to draw troops away from the east and keep things from stabilization force having to move around to try and stop other chaos being made, but in turn trying to create that chaos. So we're trying to pull forces out of the Velika front, Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, pushing up in other sectors. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we start seeing more pushing then around Sumy. So, of course, another wonder waff went through the other day. Now, it wasn't the Gripens, this time the US sanctioning two more Russian oil giants. So what is the actual impact and effect of this? Well, time is going to tell. But what we do know is it's been years and years and years that Russia has known sanctions are coming or has been looking for other markets for their oil. So today we're going to go over this article here. This is from the Carnegie Endowment by this gentleman here, Sergei Vakulenko, 25 years experience in the oil and gas industry as an economist, manager, executive consultant, including Dutch Shell, and of course, until 22, he worked for strategy and innovations at Gazprom Neft. We know what happened with Gazprom in Feb 2022. But of course, very, very knowledgeable on this and asking other people behind closed doors of who should I be looking at to get an idea of the impact of this. They pointed towards this guy. This is the same guy that spoke about the fuel shortages that we don't hear that much about anymore, but everything was apparently collapsing at that. So let's go over this. Will Trump's sanctions make a dent in Russia's oil exports? Well, it depends on Washington's appetite for enforcement. The imposing new sanctions was punishment for Moscow's lack of engagement with then not a peace process, but with a ceasefire process. I think calling it a peace process is incorrect, but a ceasefire process. Sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil attracted a lot of attention because they are the first to be introduced by since Trump returned to the White House. Apart from that, there was little new about the measures of Rosneft and Lukoil are now under broadly the same restrictions as then the other one and Gazprom. Like the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Biden's sanctions initially appeared to be a big deal, but they did not dent oil production or export volumes for either company. So in the beginning, there is a lot of speculation. It seems like it, but then it is a lot less following on. And this is exactly what I said when this came in, was in the beginning, we'll likely see a lot of up and down, but long term, that will be what the real situation tells us. They didn't dent oil production or export volumes for either company. While overhead costs of delivery for oil to China and India initially increased, they subsequently returned to pre-sanction levels. Experience would therefore suggest that Rosneft and Lukoil will be able to continue operating in a similar fashion despite US restrictions. In fact, Trump did not have to come up with brand new sanctions to inconvenience Moscow. It would have been enough to simply enforce existing US sanctions, such as the oil price cap. But that would not have led to an instantaneous effect and would have looked like a continuation of the Biden-era policy making. And of course, you see Trump, anything Biden did to try and throw out, but again, calling this still Biden's war, which is completely just ridiculous at this point in time. India and China are unlikely to stop buying Russian oil. They're also prepared to stand up for their sovereignty in the face of US pressure, especially China's not going to stop, but especially India acting as the great balancer between the East and West and having a nationalist government. They don't want to lose that sovereignty and reliance on the US. We see that from oil all the way through to military equipment and being part of BRICS, but then part of other Western economic alliances as well. It's possible that large Chinese and Indian refineries will temporarily feign a willingness to give up Russian oil, but they will resume purchases when Trump's attention wanders. Bloomberg today is talking that a lot of these Indian companies, they're not going to stop. Anyway, like when people saying India's not buying it, a lot of this is bought through intermediaries anyway, so it doesn't look like they're buying it. The same way the Europeans say that we're not buying Russian oil, but it's coming through intermediaries. Same way we're saying we're cutting down our CO2, but we're just burning it in another country. If this is what comes to pass, it would mean Russia losing out on a few billion US dollars every year, but little more than that. It's possible this financial blow might push the Kremlin to spend a bit less on defense, which might help Ukraine, but it's not nearly enough for Putin to start thinking about changing course. So it'd be a few billion, but it's not going to be in the tens or hundreds of billions that many are speaking of, and that everything is falling apart and there's coups happening at the moment. Nevertheless, there will be some short-term impacts. In particular, sanctions will reduce the volume of Russian oil exports and create problems for Rosneft and Lukoil's foreign projects. Together, the two Russian oil majors account for about half Russia's oil production. So this means that more than 80% of Russia's liquefied hydrocarbon production is under US sanctions. These have both large business projects abroad. They have a stake in India's largest refinery, 30% of Egypt's offshore gas, at least on paper, and controls a majority stake in Germany's Schwelt oil refinery, which is taken under German government control following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As I have seen, I have been reading a little bit that Germany could be up for billions and billions of dollars due to this. The new US sanctions only include exemptions for two joint projects with US companies. These two. The remaining oil joint ventures will encounter problems paying dividends, making operational decisions and working with contractors. Germany has already applied to Washington for an exemption for the oil refinery, which is still formerly owned by Rosneft. While Berlin's request is likely to be granted, it's possible the US could seek to use the issue to push Europe into a more hardline position on Russian energy. And we see, of course, the Europeans wanting everyone to have the most hardline position here, but not willing to take it themselves. The pressing question for international markets is, what will happen to Russian oil exports in the coming months? Well, it depends on how zealously the Trump administration approaches the enforcement. The most extreme scenario is that international markets lose 4 million barrels a day of oil, or 1.5 million a day of oil products. Such volumes would be impossible to replace quickly, meaning big price rises. Of course, supply and demand. The important questions are, what exactly does Trump want, and how much effort is he willing to expend to get it? If his goal is to send Putin a message that the White House is unhappy about Russia's attitude, that they're not willing to come to, he calls it negotiation, but not willing to talk about or agree to a ceasefire, then it might sufficiently irritate Lukoil and Rosneft by devaluing their assets and increasing the overheads. If, on the other hand, the more serious, and again, this depends on how zealous Trump actually is, if he's actually seeking to remove large volumes of Russian crude from the international markets, it risks creating an incentive for Russia to find workarounds and causing problems for the economies of the US and its allies, as well as generating anger among voters in the West when prices rise at the pump. So, of course, it is, again, just supply and demand. If you're looking to take this out of the market, it can't be backfilled, you're going to see prices rise. The initial market reaction of the oil spiked about $5 a barrel. If Trump is really earnest for the former scenario, the price jump would likely be more like $30 a barrel. He says most analysts seem to believe there will be some sort of short-term turbulence as a result, but ultimately the Russian exports won't change much. And again, the reliance here is really on India and China, and likely India will temporarily reduce its purchases while China will continue buying at the same rate, although it won't absorb the values not being bought by India. That means Russian oil imports could fall by at least 700,000 barrels per day. But he says such volumes are relatively easy to replace. OPEC Plus recently reversed a strategy of output cuts. It means more oil is currently produced than is being consumed. So if you are not aware, OPEC Plus, they basically have a throttle and a clutch on oil going out to maintain the price of it. They could pump a shitload more than they are, but they have quotas on this. This is why a lot of countries have actually been invaded before, but they have quotas on this to try and keep oil at a price of which they are making profit on. It's worth noting that the profit on oil margins are much higher in the Arab states and Russia than it is in the US. China is buying up most of the excess oil, then putting it into storage at a rate of around 1 million barrels per day, meaning it would be easy for international markets to find an additional 700,000 barrels a day. Either China would buy less oil for its reserves, or Saudi Arabia and the UAE would ramp up production. So he's not saying that it is critical. For Russia, reducing its exports by 700,000 barrels per day of oil would mean a 15% decrease in foreign currency earnings compared with now, creating problems for both government and oil companies. In the long term, such sanctions pressure would undoubtedly end up weakening the Russian economy and undermining its ability to withstand a sustained confrontation with the West. However, it also incentivizes growth of oil markets unconnected to the Western financial system and accelerates a trend towards deglobalization, and I will add de-dollarization as well. And this is the throttle clutch scenario that is going on in this sector at the moment. Yes, it's having effect, but we see the weaponization of currency, sanctions, tariffs, whatever you'd like to call it, incentivizing movement to markets outside of the Western financial system. This is why the Europeans, at least with their heads screwed on, are not looking, some of them, at touching those sovereign assets, because they know that hits, again, the fucking turbo NOS Dom Toretto boost on deglobalization, de-Europeanization, de-dollarization, de-Euroization, de-poundization, if you will, de-pound, out of those systems. And we see China doing this with gold. We see them doing it with panda bonds against the yen. So keep an eye on that. That is really the story of this century, is going to be the movement in it, and it may even be quicker. It might be this war, and as well Israel's actions over the past 2 years that has sped this up, I believe, probably 50 years, the movement into a multipolarity and financial systems pegged by different, so US pegged by the US, and then the Chinese looking like they're trying to peg against gold again. So that's really the story of the next decade, century. It's actually going to be a move into that system. Of course, we can fall into the Thucydides trap of can a rising power rise peacefully or not. We have spoken about that a lot. So again, the US, there is concern about this remaining USD with its hedge Nordic status, but also having impact. How does this look? Again, we will see. Time will tell. And the time will tell on these sanctions actions again. But what I'll say is the returns on sanctions have been less and less and less. From sanctions package number 1 to number 19, they're not having an equal amount of effect. So I think we're going to see similar on this. And I think it's going to hurt the Russian economy, but it's not going to be enough with the new plan of just to hurt Russia so much that it forces a withdrawal, and that they'll come begging on their knees if Putin can get his needs with stage 8 cancer to then surrender the parts of which they occupy and everything else. So the tactic here, I think we may see as being, I'll use the word maybe foolish or not returning in a number of years. But again, could be incorrect. Legends, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.